You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I am here once again looking at a talk by Andrew Snelling. I'm not sure what it is about his particular brand of dishonesty, but it really bugs me. And it's been something like a year from the time of my writing this that my last video about him was published, which means it'll be well over a year between that and this one being made public. So I thought it was time to revisit him. Today he's talking at Quentin Road Baptist Church, which is in the Chicago area. The topic is about how apparently science confirms a young Earth. And I have cut out the particularly churchy stuff at the beginning and end, including a hymn and a bunch of church announcements that aren't really relevant to us. That still leaves us with well over an hour of Andy Snelling though, so let's just dive right in.
Science confirms that the Earth is young, just as the Bible teaches.
Weird how the scientific world seems not to have noticed that, isn't it?
So we're going to start dealing with the issue of the age of the Earth, and we'll circle back to what the scriptures say later on.
I think people who watch me regularly already know this, but some of you might be new to this channel, so let me tell you how I feel about what the Bible says about a topic. I like the Bible. I read it. I have some knowledge of the original languages. I like to talk to biblical scholars, and I have more than one video about the Bible and what it's trying to convey. That being said, when it comes to science, nothing matters less to me than what the Bible has to say on a topic. Reality isn't beholden to the Bible, neither is science, as a study of the natural reality of the world. When it comes to science, what I care about is twofold: the data and what people who know more than me about a topic have to say about that data. That might not be obvious to me as a layman in basically every field, although I like to think a well-read and intelligent layman. And no, before you ask, I am not in my estimation a linguist, a paleontologist, or a historian, despite being mistaken frequently for either of the first two and having a degree in history.
But most people don't realise
that young Earth creationists even exist, because not only are they a minority among Christians, they make absolutely no difference in the world of science at all, except as annoyances.
the age of the Earth, they think that the geologists have proven it because they've measured it based on the dating of Earth rocks.
I think most people have just never worried about it. Not that they have a positive belief that it was measured by measuring rocks on Earth. As I'm sure we're about to be told, it wasn't. It was measured by dating meteorites, since the whole solar system formed at about the same time according to every model of solar system formation that I'm aware of. So meteorites should be about the same age as Earth overall.
And it's proven, therefore, that the Earth is 4.57 billion years old. But most people don't realise that the Earth's age was never determined by dating Earth rocks.
That's kind of true, but only kind of. The oldest rocks that originated on Earth that have been found are the rocks of the Acosta Gneiss in the Canadian Shield. They are some 4 billion years old. This means that whether or not we accept the slightly older dates derived from meteorites, we have a minimum age for the Earth of 4 billion years. This might be a good argument if all the rocks on Earth were under 6 or 10,000 years old, and all we had were the meteorite dates to indicate a far older age for the Earth. But that's not the situation. Also, this is unrelated, but I have to say I like the design on that lectern. It's basically the church's logo, which itself is well balanced and nicely symmetrical. Whoever designed that logo did a bang-up job, in my opinion.
That must surprise you. You would think the geologists have found the oldest rocks on Earth and that's the age of the Earth. No.
It's close. The actual date is only about 13% older than the date we'd get by just going based on known Earth rocks. It's like guessing that someone is 40, but they're actually 45. Sure, it's not right, but then is it actually that big of a deal? It certainly doesn't mean that you should have actually guessed that they were born an hour and a half ago, which is what Snelling is doing with the age of the Earth.
The Earth's claimed age was not derived from Earth rocks. It was actually derived from meteorites.
Yeah, I know, and so does everyone watching, because I can actually get to the point.
From a group of meteorites, the radioactive dating of a group of meteorites. And here it is. It was in the mid-1960s. Claire Patterson at Caltech, he uranium-lead dated, or lead-lead dated. Lead-lead dating is using the two uranium, there's uranium-238 and uranium-235. that have two different lead end members, and we'll come back to that in a moment, so I'm already talking big science.
I wonder if he'll mention the fact that according to his own on-screen graphic, an isochron dating technique was used, which uses different dating methods but also involves plotting the isotopic ratios on a chart to see if they form a linear distribution, which if they do, rules out leaching and contamination, which are common things creationists complain about when attempting to discredit the science of radiometric dating.
But he dated the Earth as a result of meteorites. Now, that's a problem because, you see, he was assuming that the meteorites represent the Earth when it formed.
Well, more the solar system as a whole, not just the Earth. But that's the implication of pretty much every idea of solar system formation that's ever been put forward in science. I know Snelling would prefer the magical explanation, but that's not how science works. He'll need a better reason to discard things like the nebular hypothesis than just, well, my interpretation of my favorite book is at odds with gravitational collapse, so I think it's dumb.
But we know that's wrong.
No, he doesn't. He's just confident it's wrong. You see, knowledge is the subset of belief that is both true and well-founded. Snelling's beliefs about this are neither true nor well-founded. You'll notice that confidence doesn't come into it. If you believe something that's true and you have good reason to think it's true, but you're not terribly confident that you're right, you still know that thing. This is why I hate the Dawkins scale of atheism. It confuses knowledge for confidence, and it makes both the words atheism and agnosticism more confusing and less helpful.
Because, you see, they assume that the Earth and the solar system formed at the same time, flung out of the sun as a hot molten blob.
Nope, no one thinks the solar system was flung out of the sun as a hot blob. The sun condensed from a cloud of mostly hydrogen, but not all of the cloud ended up in the sun. The debris that was moving fast enough to orbit the protosun formed a disk, and differences in gravity within that disk caused other objects to collapse and form, including the planets and asteroids.
But you see, they're wrong. Why are they wrong?
Because Andrew Snelling thinks the Bible disagrees with reality, and so it's reality that must give way.
See, they're assuming an evolutionary history.
Only in the broadest sense. Evolution isn't just a synonym for science that shows that young Earth creationism is wrong. They're assuming a previously well-supported hypothesis. That's normal in science. When Snelling goes to identify a rock sample he took, he assumes things like the hardness and streak color of rocks that have been previously defined. He doesn't have to go around and demonstrate the whole Mohs hardness scale or redo every single streak test. He can just reference previous and currently uncontested work in his field. That's true for science broadly. If you don't like the hypothesis that is used as the basis of the research, whining that it was the basis of the research isn't going to do anything. You actually have to do something to refute the underlying assumption that is itself the conclusion of previous science.
To then prove that evolutionary history, by the way.
Yeah, that's how science works. If you want to test a hypothesis, you assume it's true, calculate the consequences of that, and then check your calculation against reality with either subsequent observations or experiments. If reality is close to your predictions, then you have provided evidence that you were right. If it is not, then either your hypothesis is wrong or incomplete, or you've done your calculations incorrectly. Once again, we have a PhD creationist evincing a fundamental lack of understanding of the basics of how science works. I do not believe that Snelling is actually confused about this. I think, based on both his education and other things I've responded to from him, that he's simply misleading his audience.
But they're wrong. Why? Because the Bible says that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
Okay, Bible stuff. I don't care. Empirical evidence or get out. After this, he just complains that the order of creation in Genesis 1 isn't what reality indicates it is. I don't care, because what's in the Bible isn't the standard in science. Hell, it's not even really the standard in Snelling's theology, since his theology is willing to just ignore parts of the Bible that are inconvenient, such as James 2:4, which flatly says that the classic Protestant doctrine of sola fide is wrong. If Snelling isn't going to take James seriously in theology, I see no reason to take Genesis seriously in science, especially since the Bible is at least trying to talk about theological matters, whereas I am not convinced it could be reasonably said to be even attempting to talk about scientific matters in virtually all passages.
But it also assumes that the radioactive dating of rocks...
That's radiometric, not radioactive dating.
...is an accurate measure and it works perfectly. Well, it doesn't.
Yes, it is accurate, and nothing works perfectly, nor does anyone assume that it does. We check. And one of the great ways we can know that it's accurate is that it's economically vital. Oil exploration is a big industry with high stakes. A successful oil well is a huge moneymaker. but they're so expensive that drilling a dry well can be a disaster. As a result, companies doing oil exploration pay a lot of people a lot of money to look for promising drill sites, and the age of the rocks is a huge part of that. The age is determined by both index fossils and radiometric dating. If they weren't accurate and reliable, then drilling oil wells would be unreliable. As a contrast, we can look at Zion Oil and Gas, which decided to base their drilling locations on the Bible, and as a result bought a bunch of oil rights in Israel and drilled dry well after dry well, because, spoiler, the Levant doesn't have a lot of oil in it. I mean, Syria has a fair bit, but even then its oil reserves pale in comparison to those of Saudi Arabia, Canada, the United States, and the Russian Federation.
And we need to explore that, because most people think that the radioactive dating is such a precise science that it's proven the Earth is old.
And they largely be right about that. Let's not forget that Snelling was part of the RATE team. The word rate here is a rather sloppy shorthand for radioisotopes and the age of the Earth. It was a group of young Earth creationists who spent years compiling studies and data in an attempt to show that radiometric dating wasn't a reliable way to establish the age of the Earth. Their final conclusion was that science supported the conventional use of radiometric dating and that they would need miracles to accelerate the nuclear decay and to remove all the heat generated by not just the nuclear decay, but all the other heat-producing processes. That if all happening in the span of a year on Earth would cause the Earth to heat to the point of basically just being a new sun. Snelling's own conclusion was that the young Earth was physically impossible. But that's okay, because he's happy to invoke magic. I don't think I need to tell you why that's not science.
Many theologians, for example, have capitulated to the geologists because they think these numbers on rocks must be absolute, and therefore they have to somehow fit it into the Bible.
Well, they are indeed absolute, even if they're wrong. In the case of dating, absolute dating is dating which gives you a number and a unit of time when asking how old something is. This is contrasted with relative dating, like stratigraphic dating, which simply tells you that a thing is younger than some things and older than others, but can't on its own tell you how old it is in terms of a number of units of time. So for example, radiometric dating can tell you that a particular stratum of, say, rhyolite is 340 million years old, whereas stratigraphic dating could tell you where in the geologic column it should go, but it can't on its own arrive at that 340 million year age. This remains true even if the numbers from radiometric dating are inaccurate.
Well, let's look at these methods.
Hold on to your butts.
And I hope to make this as simple as possible for you.
Probably because if he gets his audience to think too much, they might realize how dumb this all is. We can't have that.
So some atoms of some elements are radioactive. For example, carbon-14 and uranium-238.
That's true.
You know, don't be worried about those numbers. 14 is the size of the nucleus of the carbon atom. It's so large that it's unstable.
No, it's not nearly that simple. Carbon-14, as the name means, has 14 nucleons. That's protons and neutrons. Carbon is the element with 6 protons, so it has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. By contrast, the much larger lead-208 has 81 protons and 126 neutrons, and it is not radioactive. It is instead stable. Nuclear stability is a function of both proton and neutron count relative to each other. You cannot determine whether a nucleus will be radioactive simply based on the number of nucleons it is made up of. For example, radium-208 has the same number of nucleons as lead-208, and it is very radioactive, with a half-life of only 1.3 seconds.
And it decays back to nitrogen-14. Well, uranium-238 is an even larger nucleus, and it decays as well.
Yeah, to the stable lead-206, which is way larger than carbon-14, which means that when he simply says that the stability of a nucleus is simply a function of the size of the nucleus, that he's lying. Because he's already stated that lead-206 is the final decay product of uranium-238 earlier in this very talk.
It has too many particles in its nucleus, in their nuclei, and so they throw those out.
At the level of uranium-238, it may well be reasonable to use nucleus size as a proxy for radioactivity, since lead-208 is the heaviest known stable nucleus. But again, that is not simply a rule that you can use, that the bigger the nucleus, the more radioactive, at least not until you get to 209 nucleons.
And the stable, so they want to become stable again.
Well, let's remember that he just personified atomic nuclei, so if he ever complains about scientists personifying anything else, we can just throw that hypocrisy back at him. But yes, unstable things by their very nature fall apart until they reach a stable state. That's what it is to be unstable in this context.
And it takes a little bit of time for that to happen in the case of uranium, well, today, and that process is known as radioactive decay.
More specifically, it's spontaneous radioactive decay, and that's an important thing to note. There are also instances of induced decay, such as induced fission or beta capture, in which particles actually hit the nucleus, causing it to be more unstable than normal, resulting in a decay that is not simply the result of a nucleus's internal instability, but is instead caused by some definite event. The distinction is important because induced nuclear reactions are heavily influenced by the flux of particles that induce the reaction, but spontaneous nuclear decay is essentially impossible to affect. The rates are based on fundamental constants of the universe, which also govern many other aspects of our reality. To change the timing of spontaneous nuclear decay, it would require fundamental changes in physics, changes that would most likely result in a universe that cannot sustain life and chemistry as we know it. Accelerating spontaneous nuclear decay would require the decrease of the strength of the strong and/or weak nuclear forces. This would not only accelerate decay, but it would mean that nuclei that are actually stable would be unstable, and this would show up as an anomaly in the isotopic ratios when they're tested for rocks formed during this acceleration event. We don't see such an anomaly, and so there is no reason to think that the nuclear forces have ever changed in their strength. That kind of change in one or more fundamental forces of the universe would itself be a miracle. But to get around this, you could simply posit that each nuclear decay was itself an individual miracle, resulting in accelerated decay. But at this point where you're stacking trillions upon trillions of miracles, you have to stop and ask yourself whether or not you actually care about being scientific, if you're willing to hand-wave away anything with increasing numbers of unevidenced miracles that aren't even mentioned in the book that is the primary reason you're even bothering to try in the first place.
The decaying atoms are called radioactive isotopes, or radioisotopes for short, and they produce elements of stable atoms. So potassium, for example, decays to argon.
Well, yes, but it's not that simple. For example, potassium-40 will decay into both argon-40 and calcium-40. Most uranium isotopes end up as lead, but they go through many steps to get there. These steps are part of what is called a decay chain, and you can check to see for the evidence of the decay chain in the rock. You can look for things like decay halos in thin sections of the rock, and since each kind of nuclear decay from each nuclide has a specific energy, you can tell which halos were produced by which nuclides. This is one of the ways to check if the daughter products present in the rock are actually from internal decay, or have contaminated the rock by entering from the outside.
Rubidium decays to strontium, uranium decays to lead.
And before uranium gets to lead, it will also go through thorium, palladium, back to uranium, then back to thorium, then to radium, then to radon. Then it has multiple ways to decay into various elements like polonium, bismuth, astatine, thallium, and mercury, all before getting to lead.
And we'll come to these in a minute. But for the way of illustration, the decaying atoms are called parent atoms.
Usually it's parent isotopes, but whatever, I'm not going to harp on about that.
And the stable atoms that they decay to are called daughter atoms. They give birth to stable daughters.
They're also called decay products. I'm not correcting them here, just adding more information.
And here's the ones that we're familiar with. Parent atom carbon-14 decays back to nitrogen-14. Uranium-238 decays to lead-206. Uranium-235 to lead-207. By the way, you've probably heard of uranium and potassium. You might not have heard of rubidium so much. But what about samarium that decays to neodymium?
I have heard of them all, but then I'm not his target audience. But also saying that potassium-40 decays to argon-40 is not quite wrong, but it's simplified to the point of absurdity. Only about 11% of potassium-40 will decay into argon-40. The other 89% or so will decay into calcium-40. The rest of the chart is accurate, though. The reason we tend to check the argon is that unlike calcium, which is highly chemically active, argon is chemically inert, which means if you find it inside a crystal, you know it wasn't there when the crystal formed because noble gases are generally excluded from crystal formation, which means that while the ratio isn't as simple as in most radiometric dating between parent and daughter, it's more reliable than using calcium-40, much of which may have been primordially present in the rock in question.
You may not realise that you need some of those rare metals for these.
Is it me, or does it seem like Andy has absolutely no regard for the intelligence of his audience? It's a common thing I see among young Earth creationist speakers. They seem to assume that their audience is dumber than a sack of rocks. I find it rather insulting on their behalf. Creationist laity are not generally stupid in my experience. They're biased, misinformed, and willing to use motivated reasoning in many cases. But that's not the same thing as being stupid.
Samarium and neodymium are rare earth metals, and neodymium is critical for those wind farms because neodymium put into the magnet makes it stronger and therefore more efficient in generating electricity.
Yep, I myself have bought many a neodymium magnet because they're the strongest magnets you can really buy for their size, and they're great for magnetizing things like models so you can swap out parts.
And so you hear people talk about critical metals, that China, for example, controls the world supply.
China, 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 China.
Well, that's why we've been scrambling here in the US and Australia and elsewhere to find resources so that we don't have to depend on China. And neodymium is one of those elements.
Ah, yes. I always wanted more geopolitics in my science lecture about the age of the Earth. Wouldn't it be great if Andy actually got to the point?
Well, what happens? It's quite simple, really. A rock we go out and collect a sample of a rock, and it's chemically tested, send it to a laboratory, and they measure how many parent and daughter atoms are in the rock.
Nope, because chemical tests can't differentiate between different isotopes of the same element. Chemistry depends on the electrons surrounding the nucleus of an atom or ion. Two isotopes of the same element, by definition, have the same number of protons, and so the same number of electrons. As a result, all isotopes of the same element will undergo the same chemistry. The tests are generally mass spectrometry, which tells you which isotopes of which elements are in a sample, but can't actually tell you what chemicals there are because the process breaks chemical bonds. This distinction is important because if you do a chemical test, you can't tell the difference between, say, uranium-235 and 238, or between lead-208 and 207. Uranium-235 has a half-life of 700 million years, whereas 238 has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. That's a huge difference, and conflating the two with a chemical test will leave you in the dark as to the age of the rock.
So, if we know the radioactive decay rate, and it's remained constant at today's measured rate,
and for it not to have remained constant is physically impossible, let's remember.
Then we can calculate how long ago all the daughter was originally parent.
Yep.
And that's the rate rocks say. Let me explain it this way. You're probably glazing over here, but...
Nope, that was about as basic an overview as I could reasonably expect, even if it was wrong in some of the details. And even if it did seem to constantly imply that we might want to take into account the possibility that the fundamental forces of the universe just sometimes have an oopsie.
Think about an egg timer or an hourglass clock. Okay, 2 glass bowls with sand grains. You put all the sand grains in the top glass bowl, and it's supposed to take an hour for all the sand grains to fall to the bottom.
This is a poor analogy for a few reasons, one of which is the decay chains I already mentioned. You see, in all cases the sand falls directly from the top to the bottom, but in nuclear decay, most parent elements go through multiple decay product stages before finally hitting the stable isotope. We can check to see if this happened. Further, in most cases we have numerous isotopes that all start decaying when the rock formed. So the analogy really should have 3 to 5 hourglasses, all of different sizes and different neck widths, all of which can be cross-checked to see if their ratios of sand at the top and sand at the bottom are all consistent with a single time of when all of them were flipped.
Okay, I'm using this analogy. It's pretty good analogy, really, when you think about it.
No.
The more you think about it, the worse it gets, near as I can tell. But I guess I can see why Andy wouldn't want to say that to his audience.
Because I've put red sand grains at the top and green sand grains at the bottom.
That's just weird. The sand in the hourglass is all the same sand. Why do we need to add this extra and impossible step to the analogy? I can't see why, but sure, whatever.
The red sand grains are the parent atoms, and the green sand grains are the daughter atoms, okay?
Sure, it's needlessly dumb, but whatever. Maybe there's some kind of magical field in the neck of the hourglass that changes the color of the sand. I don't care.
And so let's imagine we're cooking a cake.
I'm going to pretend it's a pie, because I prefer pie. Also, cheesecake is actually a pie because it has a crust and a filling. For me, a cake has to be made of batter or dough the whole way through, not just at the bottom.
Okay, and you in your kitchen and you mix up, by the way.
No, by the way, he's just going to tell a story about a time he assumed that everyone preparing a meal in a church kitchen was a woman, and he was corrected. It's neither surprising nor relevant that Andy is a sexist.
And you put the the mixture in your cake pan to bake it, and you put it in the oven. Well, you want to time how long it's in the oven, so you use an hourglass clock.
No, I tend to use the microwave or my phone's clock app, but whatever. Let's pretend this is like the 1920s and I'm using sand to time my baking.
So you start by putting all the sand grains in the top.
No, I don't. Has he ever used an hourglass? They're generally sealed. You don't put the sand anywhere. After it has run out and all the sand is at the bottom, you just flip it over. I think Andy here just does not understand how hourglasses work, which might be why he thinks you can have red sand at the top and green sand at the bottom, even though that's not how they work.
You walk out of the kitchen, maybe you've got to go to the garage and you've got to do something, or the laundry, and you come back and you want to know how long you've been away. Well, what do? You look at that hourglass clock and you measure, visually, you decide how many sand grains are still at the top and how many are at the bottom. So that's what a geologist does. He gets a rock and he finds out how many parent and how many daughter atoms are in the rock.
Yeah, this part of the analogy is okay. Let's see how he screws it up. Of course, one group of people unlikely to screw up analogies are my subscribers, because they get to hear my amazingly awesome analogies when I make new videos. So take a minute to check to see if you're subscribed, and if you're not, why not go ahead and fix that, and also turn on notifications so that the subscription actually means something to YouTube.
Well, what if you find that half the sand grains are still at the top and half are down the bottom? How long have you been out of the room?
All things being equal, and assuming a linear flow rate, about half an hour.
Half an hour, okay?
Okay.
Because you know the rate at which the sand grains fall, because you already tested it. You know, you've used a mechanical watch like this, and you've watched all the sand grain. You know it takes an hour, so you've accurately measured your clock.
Well, I probably relied on people who made the thing to tell me how long it runs for, but whatever. Where's the but that we all know is coming?
Clock. So that's as simple as it gets. The geologist finds out how many parent and daughter atoms there are, and then he works out how long ago all the green atoms, the daughters, were originally parent. Okay, because he knows how long it takes for it to fall, to decay, okay? And therefore, you back calculate, and that's the age of the rock. That's how long ago the rock formed. Okay, I haven't lost too many of you already?
I'm certainly keeping up, and I suspect my audience is as well. Because unlike creationists, I don't think my audience is a gaggle of gibbering morons who can't tie their shoes without explicit instructions and diagrams.
Now, it's quite simple, therefore. So starting with all the sand grains in the top bowl, it takes 1 hour for all the red sand grains to fall to the bottom as green sand atoms. So a rock is chemically tested for these red and green atoms.
Again, they're not actually red and green, just FYI.
And we make assumptions. And that's the important thing. You know, whenever you see the scientists make a statement about things that happened in the past, you should immediately ask the question, what are they assuming? What are their assumptions?
A big one is that the weak nuclear force did not change in the past, which isn't just an assumption, it's also testable, and we see no evidence of it having varied. So like most so-called assumptions in science, it's actually just accepting science that has already been well demonstrated and moving on, all while having the ability to check if this conclusion about prior scientific work is actually valid.
Because the assumptions are critical. If you start with the wrong assumptions...
Like, for example, the assumption that Iron Age literature should be the thing that you check your science against, and that rejecting reality is a good thing when reality and the Iron Age text disagree according to your interpretation.
You're going to get the wrong answer.
Like that Earth is only 1/750,000th of its real age?
It's just like I said this morning.
I wasn't around for that, so I have no idea what was said that morning.
The master of the feast assumed that the grapes had grown on vines and been harvested, and the wine had come by a process when Jesus had actually created. He had the wrong assumptions.
Okay, cool, but what does this have to do with anything? If a miracle occurred, then yeah, science is going to have trouble with that one. But that's because such things are physically impossible and largely outside the scope of science. This talk is called Science Confirms a Young Earth, so appealing to miracles is just an admission that science in fact does no such thing. Because if it did, you wouldn't need to appeal to miracles.
Okay, so if the rate of radioactive decay has remained, that is falling at today's constant rate, it can be calculated how long it took the measured amount of green atoms to accumulate from the red atoms to fall.
I feel like that sentence could have used a few more editing passes.
And so you know how long it's been operating, the hourglass clock, which is the rock's age. So I said, though, that you've got to have assumptions. And there's three crucial ones.
Ooh, are we finally getting to the actual point? That sure would be nice.
And they're even more crucial when it comes to these dating methods, okay? Remember our analogy?
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Get on with it!
Three crucial assumptions, okay. What would happen if all the sand grains at the bottom hadn't come from the red sand grains at the top?
Then I wouldn't have used the hourglass because it would have been lying on its side, which doesn't really correspond to anything in this analogy. But remember, because we actually have numerous options for radiometric dating corresponding to multiple hourglasses of various sizes, we can check for this. If one of our dating methods is significantly off, it may well be because of initial daughter products, and we can cross-check to confirm this. For example, say I had 4 hourglasses of all different sizes, and 3 of them indicated that they were flipped over a half an hour ago, but one indicated that it was flipped over 45 minutes ago. Chances are that there's something off about that one. Maybe it wasn't completely empty at the top when it was turned over. Maybe the stated duration on it is wrong, etc. This is what isochron dating is for. All the relevant isotopes are checked for multiple dating techniques, and the ratios and dates those ratios give are checked. In this way, we can avoid being wrong because some rock just happened to form with a bit extra lead or something. But further, some decay products such as argon are chemically excluded from the crystals forming in rocks because they do not undergo chemical reactions, which means that it's pretty much impossible for them to be primordial.
What if you didn't know the initial, you weren't there at the beginning, and maybe there were some green atoms already in the hourglass clock at the bottom when your clock started?
Isn't that exactly what we just went over? Am I missing something new? I don't know, let me know in the comments what you think.
If you weren't there at the beginning, you see, the geologists weren't there millions of years ago when the rock formed, so how do they know the original amounts of parent and daughter atoms?
By adding the two up and checking for contamination by things like isochron dating and checking for metamorphosis or water leaching into the rock. I know that sounds like a really simple answer, but that's because it kind of is. This is actually a pretty basic aspect of radiometric dating. You check to see if the requirements for the technique to work are met by the sample being submitted, and if they're not, then you know you can't rely on the date. But if they are, then you can. And again, we know we can rely on it because a $1 trillion industry relies heavily on it working. Trust me, oil companies do not give a f about proving the Earth to be old, getting people away from Christ, or anything like that. They just care about dollar signs, and radiometric dating gives them money.
Why would there not be daughter atoms in some of these rocks?
Because some daughter nuclei would be chemically excluded, and also in some cases there might be. That's why you check.
Why would the Earth give you the same age as meteorites?
Because they formed at about the same time within probably a few score million years, which at ages like 4.5 billion is basically simultaneous.
Well, because God made the meteorites of the same stuff as the Earth.
I mean, sure, if you want to say that God is the ultimate cause of the universe and therefore is the creator of the solar system and the nebula from which it collapsed, I won't stop you. I am not here to get people to stop believing in God. I am happy for people to believe in God or not, at least as far as this channel is concerned. In private, I have my own beliefs, lacks of belief, and opinions, but they don't matter to the science, so I don't talk about them.
The meteorites come from asteroids, and some of these asteroids have a core and a mantle and a crust exactly like the Earth.
Not really. Except for the largest ones like Ceres, most asteroids are far too small to have had much density sorting due to gravity before they cooled. This can be seen in the fact that they didn't even have time to reach hydrostatic equilibrium, that is, become more or less a sphere. As a result, asteroids are much more homogeneous than, say, the Earth is. But then again, it's not like there was no density sorting at all, so he's not completely wrong.
Well, obviously, God used the same design and used the same stuff to make all these different things.
But that's not obvious, that's not in the Bible, and there's no particular reason God had to make the Earth out of mostly iron and silicon, and couldn't have made asteroids out of mostly lead and tungsten. The only reason Andy thinks this is the case is because he started with the assumption that the solar system was specially created at some point, and then on finding that asteroids and the Earth have the same basic elemental composition, came to the conclusion that God just did it that way. This wasn't a prediction of creationism. It wasn't even a retrodiction of creationism. It was an accommodation by creationists to the data.
And God loves variety, so why wouldn't he make the daughter atoms as well as the parent atoms? And the daughter atoms didn't come from radioactive decay at the beginning.
Yeah, why wouldn't God just make everything to look like it wasn't specially created and then tell people it is specially created, just to fool them? I don't know, probably because that makes God an omnipotent trickster and it destroys the ability to have any reason to believe anything. Meaning it requires you to abandon any sense of an epistemic framework and makes knowledge of any kind impossible. Maybe that's why, Andy. Or maybe we can just not let an omnipotent liar into our philosophical framework, and that way we can actually have a philosophical framework rather than just chaos.
You see, if we weren't there at the beginning to know the initial conditions, how can we be sure that our clock works?
By checking. Just like the last time this question was asked. You check other methods, you check other meteorites, you check other rocks, you make predictions, etc. In other words, you do this thing that Andy seems not to understand in the least, called, let me check. Yes, sky ants. Wait, no. Science, yes, that's it. You do science.
And so assumption number one is there are no green atoms at the bottom of the glass bowl at the beginning.
That's less an assumption and more like a prerequisite, and is something that you can check on. And in some cases, it isn't actually a problem at all because chemistry was a thing in the past and continues to be a thing in the present, and I expect will continue to be a thing in the future.
And I'm going to give you some examples where these assumptions are shown to fail from the very literature that the scientists refer to.
Thereby showing that scientists are aware of the limits of their techniques and so know when not to use them. That's an interesting tactic.
In every case, you need an observer because we weren't there in the past. So assumption number two is that all the daughter atoms measured today must have only come from radioactive decay in situ of the parent atoms. In other words, the glass bowls were a closed system.
Well, in the case of hourglasses, they're generally sealed, so you can check to see if they've been tampered with. In the case of rocks, you can also check. Most processes that would allow significant amounts of any chemical into or out of a rock involve processes that are evident in the rock itself, such as metamorphism, which is just what happens when rocks are under lots of heat and or pressure for a long time. We've already mentioned a gneiss in Canada, and gneiss is a metamorphic rock, meaning that you have to be careful when radiometrically dating it. But again, we can check to see if there are discordant dates among multiple dating techniques, and use that to test this particular condition of the technique.
Well, when you're out of the room, you didn't know that your mischievous 10-year-old son came in and lifted the lid and put a few more red sand grains at the top.
Has this man never even seen an hourglass? They don't normally just have easily accessible lids specifically because the exact amount of sand in them is important and has been calibrated to keep the accuracy of the hourglass. You can't just normally open them up, stealthily add some sand, and then seal it back up. And for the very same reasons, the same is generally true of rocks. They can gain and lose things, but it's not common, and you can generally tell if there's reason to suspect that this has happened.
So that when you came in and did the measurement, you thought you'd been out half an hour, but actually it'd been longer. Because the system was contaminated, it was open.
And this is why hourglasses are kind of a stupid way to do this analogy. Water clocks would have been better, since those are generally open to the air, but then again, I don't know if people know what water clocks are. I mean, they're basically the same concept as an hourglass, but with water in open containers rather than sand in a closed glass bulb, but oh well.
That's the second assumption. All the green atoms must have only come from the falling of the red atoms. That is, there's been no contamination.
Good thing we can check to see if that assumption is satisfied, and let's remember, fundamentally, when dollars are on the line, radiometric dating works. And unlike many other modern dating techniques, you're not going to get catfished when you do radiometric dating.
And that requires an observer. Have the geologists been there for millions of years to watch these rocks not having been contaminated? No.
So what? Was anyone sitting in Andy's mom's uterus to watch him be conceived? No. And yet I bet very few people would dispute that it happened for that reason. Turns out that sometimes the present shows us things about the past because things like the laws of nature, time, and causality are things that exist. Indeed, even the idea of wanting a witness to an event is based on the idea that these things exist, because otherwise, how could an eyewitness be reliable? It's almost like demanding an intelligent witness to an event to accept that event as having occurred is a self-defeating standard of evidence, and not one that even young Earth creationists consistently use. Creationists generally have no problems with things like forensic science being used to solve crimes when there are no eyewitnesses to the crime, or at least none who will testify. But this is just rank hypocrisy on their part. Either empirical data gathered in the present can give us information about the past, or it can't. Andy wants to have it both ways for some reason. I mean, I know the reason. It's because he needs to be able to have double standards so he can reject the science he doesn't like while accepting the science he does like, even though there's no evidentiary or philosophical justification for it.
By the way, most of the samples they collect to date are collected at the surface of the Earth.
In a shocking twist, most geologists are not mole people.
Now, I can take you down a mine shaft.
Pass. I do not want to go anywhere where Andrew Snelling is in any way part of keeping me safe.
Down half a mile or more, and the rocks down there I can show you, still show the effects of weathering.
I mean, yeah, rocks under the ground used to be on the surface, unless they're intrusive, which most of them are not. This shouldn't be surprising, but it's also why samples are often taken by drilling into a rock, not just crushing up the whole thing, surface included.
Weathering contaminates rocks.
Yeah, at the surface, but if you have a bunch of basalt being worn down by wind and rain, and then you clean that in a lab, break it in half, and get a sample from the middle, you don't really have to worry much about surface contamination. This isn't really that complicated, nor is it news to actual scientists.
Most people don't realise that some of the uranium deposits form as a result of weathering of background amounts of uranium that's concentrated by water carrying it in solution, and then it's deposited in a concentrated manner. And that's why it becomes economic to mine it.
Yep, I'm sure lots of people don't realize that. But you know what geologists realize? That you can't really radiometrically date sedimentary rocks. So who cares if the best concentrations of uranium are in waterborne sedimentary rocks? Those aren't the rocks being radiometrically tested. It's also not an example of the contamination of an igneous rock that would affect the dating. Unless he really wants to say that the weathering is pulling the uranium from the middle of the parent rock. If he doesn't want to say that, I would be fascinated to know what mechanism he proposes for this.
So we know that contamination is a problem, and I'll give you some examples in a minute.
I look forward to it.
And then the obvious third assumption is that the rate of radioactive decay has been constant at today's measured rate.
In other words, one of the assumptions is that the fundamental forces of the universe that govern physical interactions between particles of matter and force carriers, etc., are what they are, and were what they are. This is just the basic assumption of science, that the universe fundamentally operated according to the same rules in the past that it does now, and that it will still operate by them in the future. That's what allows predictions of future data in science, both about events in the past and in the future. Without this assumption, nothing in science can be made. You'd be stuck in the world of Al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, where there is no such thing as a natural world that operates under consistent principles, and instead every single effect is a direct miracle by God. And if you think causality is a thing, then it's just because God wants to be consistent today. But he doesn't have to be. The publication and popularity of that book, by the way, is around the time that the Islamic world started to slide away from being on the cutting edge of science, and entered a long slide into backwardness and lack of scientific progress that still plagues many Muslim-majority places today. There's a reason no one is rushing to Saudi Arabia to get their degrees. The rejection of the temporal invariance of the nature of reality is devastating to any scientific progress, and should be rejected simply on the ground that it makes any study of the natural world fundamentally impossible. I also want to note that I am in no way saying that Muslim scientists don't exist or don't do good work. They absolutely do. But it's hard to argue that the popularity in majority Muslim regions of a philosophy completely antithetical to science didn't hinder the ability of those areas to produce scientists. I also want to point out that this philosophy of radical occasionalism is not universal in Islam, and it never has been. Many famous Muslim scholars like Ibn Sina, or as he's often known in Western circles, Avicenna, have a very scientific outlook and made great strides that moved forward human knowledge in important ways. So I guess in conclusion, being an Ibn Sina, not an Al-Ghazali, and Andy is being an Al-Ghazali.
That means the red atoms have always fallen at the same rate to produce the green atoms as we measure them. And that requires an observer as well. Have the geologists been there for millions of years to check that radioactive decay has been constant?
No, nor do they need to be. Because remember, the only way to vary this, short of rejecting literally all of science, is to say that the fundamental forces of the universe changed. But that would not only change the rate of spontaneous nuclear decay, but also which nuclides are radioactive in the first place, which means we would see evidence of decay chains that no longer occur. We see no such evidence, hence the nuclear forces have not meaningfully varied during the history of the Earth. In fact, the Oklo natural reactor is a great example of this that even uses some induced decay in the form of induced nuclear fission. But the important thing is that after the fission, the resulting nuclides decay spontaneously in ways that are both predictable and traceable into the past, simply based on what's found in the rock. The rocks in the reactor, which is in Gabon by the way, show the telltale ratios of being the result of induced fission of uranium-235, which corresponds to the also noticeably depleted amount of that isotope compared to the normal ratios on Earth. If the rate of decay had changed in the past, then this would not be the case, yet it is. Hence, the Oklo reactor is yet further evidence that no, physics didn't just pull a fast one on us a few thousand years ago.
Yes, as I say, what if your mischievous 10-year-old also put in a few drops of water into the glass bowl? What's that going to do?
Well, apparently, since these glass bowls are just open to the air, probably evaporate and cause no noticeable effect. But really, the analogy is closer to if your kids scratch the outside of the hourglass. What's that going to do? The answer is nothing that really matters.
It's going to clog it so that the falling rate slows down.
Not in his stupid scenario of open hourglasses, but whatever. This doesn't at all map onto nuclear decay because there's nothing you could add to a rock that will accelerate the rate of spontaneous decay. Because nothing you add will affect the nucleus, short of adding more radiation to induce nuclear reactions. But induced nuclear reactions do not follow the same decay chains as spontaneous ones. So we can also tell if that happened, which is how scientists know that Oklo was a fission reactor.
How do we know that the decay rate has not been constant?
We don't know that. In fact, we have overwhelming evidence that it has been constant, and nothing to even hint that it could be otherwise.
Or has been constant in the past?
Physics.
So, assumption one, number one, all the parent atoms, daughter atoms derive from parent atoms, no initial inheritance.
Which can be verified in most cases.
Assumption number two, no other processes have affected the parent-daughter relationship, so there can't be contamination.
Which can be verified in most cases.
And three, constant decay rates, no changed rates.
Which is fundamentally just the assumption that science works. Given that he's using a microphone and was live streamed to a website via a camera, all of which depend on engineering based on physics, which is part of science, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that yes, in fact, science does work.
Well, it should be obvious that none of these assumptions are provable.
In the mathematical sense, that's true, but then that's true about all of science. But since two of them can be verified, and one is just that science works in the first place, I think they're fine despite the fact that they're not mathematical theorems.
The past cannot be observed and measured and tested.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
And these assumptions are not even reasonable.
I'd love to hear why not, especially since they can be tested.
Because we know that these three assumptions have been repeatedly falsified.
I don't know that, and I suspect that neither does Andy. But I do look forward to seeing his evidence for this, which definitely won't be cherry-picked, lied about, or in any way full of Trojan sources.
And I'm going to show you that tonight. They're falsified.
Well, we'll have to leave this attempt to show that for the next time. This video is already long enough. We'll continue on with these sources that definitely say what Snelling needs them to, and definitely won't be taken out of context next time. In the meantime, please hit like if you've enjoyed this video, and if you didn't, then feel free to hit dislike. Either way, let me know what you thought in the comments, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you've subscribed now, or you are already subscribed, check to make sure you have notifications turned on so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovend, Felgevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, E2V, Strawberry Vein, Denny5252, Aileron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Monkey They Them, Sphincter of Doom, and Volus. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.